Welcome to this special episode of AU Manufacturing Conversations, which is part of our annual Australia's 50 Most Innovative Manufacturers campaign. This time around, the 50 Most Innovative has been made possible through the support of these wonderful sponsors: Australia Wide Engineering Recruitment, TXM Lean Solutions, the Industry Capability Network, Bonfiglioli Australia, the Advanced Manufacturing Growth Centre, and the SmartCrete CRC. If you're interested in nominating, please see a link in the episode details. It's completely free to be a part of this campaign and always will be, and we'll be celebrating the announcement of the 50 Most Innovative list and the award winners at a special breakfast event on May 7 at Crown Melbourne during Australian Manufacturing Week. Now on with the show. Ollie, thank you very much for joining us here on AU Manufacturing Conversations. It's a pleasure to have you on the program.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to talking.
Looking forward to listening. So let's get started with the standard opening question, and that is, how did you get here and what do you make?
So Medsalv is a company that I started to solve a problem that no one else was able to or willing to solve with at the time, and that was single-use medical devices, which were filling our landfills. So super expensive, wasteful, imported from overseas predominantly. And so what we did is we built a process to remanufacture those, so take them from hospitals, clean them, test them, inspect them, and sell them back to those same hospitals for a lower price. And we're now we're a social enterprise with the highest scoring B Corp in medical devices at last time I checked. And we have active remanufacturing facilities in New Zealand and now in Australia as well, which is really our focus.
Wonderful. So let's flesh things out a little more with some info about your origin story. I've read a few interviews and it seems like you were, if you want, a bit of a black sheep in the family that was filled up with doctors and medical professionals. I may be misinterpreting that, but it seemed like you were, as an engineer, perhaps a rarity in the family. But I'll let you, explain how things came to be and what the inspirations were and your path towards creating Medsalv. And I'd like to hear that from you now, please.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I am a little bit, I suppose. I've got a lot of doctors in my family, not to say that everyone in my family is of a medical fraternity, but my mother's a doctor, my grandparents are both general practitioners, my auntie was a physiotherapist and works in health still, and my uncle was a surgeon on that side of the family. So I'd always been interested in health, and at one stage I even wanted to become a surgeon, but when I went to university, I ended up doing a mechanical engineering degree. And after I did that, I did a master's in engineering management. And for that master's, you're able to do like an applied project for another company, or you can start your own company. And the project I was going to do kind of fell through, which was with a medical company. And I was basically having a conversation with my uncle, who's a surgeon, about what is going on in the health sector just before the 2017 New Zealand election. And I put it to him, what happens if the party that is polling well gets in? And he said, look, it's not about that, what their policies mean. It's all about how they're spending the money. It's not about how much money they're going to spend, which is what their policies were. It's about how they spend it. That's the issue. And I'd sort of got into this conversation with the idea of, I can find some information about what could be a way to forward for a project for me. He actually went into the garage of his house and he pulled out a box of expired, unused, single-use medical devices. And he said, look, you should find a way to sterilize them. There's some facilities in New Zealand you might be able to find if they can sterilize them and you can sell them for your back to hospitals. That could be your project. And I ran with that. And the first thing I did is I went and talked to customers. So he went and talked to some nurses at one of the local hospitals, and I went and talked to them a couple of times and asked whether they'd actually had any ideas around this, which products would be good. And ended up going to a completely different product category, but with a similar business model. So moving away from taking stuff that was expired and unused, but to stuff that was used and thrown away on an ongoing basis, which obviously forms the basis for a business model. That's how it started. That was 2017. I finished my master's and now it's a company across both countries that is a fully registered social enterprise as well.
So you mentioned, the business model. Tell me about how that evolved. Were there other sort of iterations of it? And when did you realize you're onto something and you might have the sort of skeleton of a viable little business?
Well, it took a long time. So I pitched the idea as part of the startup program at the university over the summer of 2017, 2018. But it was slow going in the health sector, as you can probably imagine. And then I won an award that was worth around $100,000 in March that year. And even from that point on, and I had proven prototype testing, et cetera, to show that the product was equivalent to the brand new product in the market. But it still took another 9 months or so to actually get the first sale. So it wasn't for a while, but I think knowing that we had a proven model was really when we started to figure out, well, actually, this is how much these things cost. And we started to look at what way could we make them? through remanufacturing that is cheaper than that. And that's when we knew that there was something. But then the next thing is actually, okay, how do you take that something and turn it into a viable business, which is really the customer engagement. Not the easiest thing in the world, I have to say, particularly in New Zealand where you don't have a regulatory system as opposed to the TGA's regulatory system in Australia. Because that means that in New Zealand, you're having to convince every individual customer of the safety and the efficacy of the product. And there's not really much teeth to the regulatory system. So if you make a mistake, you're not going to get in trouble. Whereas in Australia, the ARTG is a different kettle of fish completely. They review every product before it gets listed, and you have to maintain all of this documentation. It's very clear what's required. So yeah, those are kind of an interesting point.
Right. So let's hear about your presence across ANZ. Are you in, I read Geelong in Australia, and a little bit about sort of headcount and how things are distributed across the two countries, please.
Yeah, we have a large presence within New Zealand. We've got around 25 to 30 staff, sort of. There's a mixture of full-time and part-timers in there across New Zealand. We've got staff in Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, and our facility is in Christchurch. Then in Australia, we're just moving over 10 staff now, and we've got some shared services that go between the two countries. We run the same types of systems for both of the businesses. They run off the same architecture in the same way that every Bunnings store runs off the same systems that you go Bunnings to Bunnings to Bunnings to Kmart to McDonald's, etc. So it's really taking a core concept and then applying that widely and expanding the benefit. So headcount across the business is 35 or so. And we are currently going through some hiring processes in Australia, which is where we see the opportunity to grow. Obviously, it's a larger market. In terms of the impact that we are having, we've remanufactured, I think, close on 500,000 devices, maybe more. And when you look at the size of them, that's massive. That's millions of dollars in savings to hospitals. And we're now active across over 120 hospitals across New Zealand and Australia, about 50-50 in each, which is remarkable given that our facility in Australia only started operating less than a year ago. So yeah, we do have a bit of reach and we are making a bit of impact.
So let's hear about your customers, please. You mentioned that you were talking to people earlier in the medical establishment when you were getting the business together. Tell me about who you're sort of selling to, etc.
So we only deal with hospitals that are conducting surgeries across Australia and New Zealand. So we work with them to facilitate the collections of their products wherever they may be. We collect from all states in Australia and New Zealand, of course, and make that super easy. So surgical hospital, we take the consumables off them, we coordinate with them and make that happen. Where possible, we're actually going into the hospital and we're doing that work ourselves and making that happen for the customer.
So consumables, tell me about the types of consumables you're collecting and remanufacturing and how you do that, I guess.
I'd say the consumables that we're collecting and remanufacturing are not like super low cost, but they're also not high cost either. The super low cost would be things like gloves, tissues, etc. The cheapest product that we remanufacture, but we do this at massive scale, is a single patient use tourniquet, and they cost around $1 each. But at the other end, like the more expensive products that we remanufacture might cost up to $200-300, depending on brand and size and all that kind of stuff. But we're not yet working in the super expensive product range, like invasive single-use devices that might cost a couple of $1,000s. So we focus in that area because it's simple, it's relatively easy compared to some of the invasive devices, and we are making a market here. We're educating people and bringing them on the journey with us, and it's a lot easier to do that with a non-invasive, non-sterile device. And it's also easier to clean because you have different requirements to meet with the essential principles of medical device design, which is what governs what happens in Australia.
Right, it's about 50 products or so at the moment?
Yeah, it is. And we've got a few more coming online, which I can't tell you about, but there are a few coming down the line. And within those sort of 50 products, some of them have multiple variations and styles. So we might be dealing with the red pen, and then we're going to deal with the blue pen as well, and we'll be adding that as well. So line extensions, if you like. But sometimes it's like we're going to deal with the red pen from Bic, and then we're going to deal with the red pen from, I don't know, other pen bands, but you get my perspective there. Stablo or something like that. So we just expand that to make the most impact within the sectors that we're targeting of health, which is so massive.
I'm guessing that a lot of the smarts are to do with the processing side of things and everything that's involved. I have no idea what's involved. So could you just tell me a little bit about the processes you've developed in-house and technologies, I guess, if you've had to come up with anything, and perhaps aligned to that, what sort of standards are you working to?
So I'll start with that one, which is the first thing is the standards. So most people don't realize that for the majority of medical devices, they don't have a standard to which they need to be made. They get made to essential principles. So whereas something like a house, you might say, well, the door needs to have a standard width and height, and the hinges go in the same place every time. With the door, you might have the width, the height, the location, etc., and that might be specified clearly in a standard. And it also might have things like, this is how high the roof should be, and this is what sort of grade it is. That's okay for your kind of run-of-the-mill house. But the reality is with medical devices, there's so many of them and they have such a variety of use cases and uses that you have to work off essential principles, which, to take it back to the house analogy, is like if you're doing an architectural build every time, you're not going to be able to use the standards. You're going to have to go back to first principles and do the thinking there. So this is kind of important because every medical device needs to demonstrate compliance, or the supplier needs to be able to demonstrate compliance of that medical device with those essential principles. So there's not necessarily a standard per device. We have to demonstrate one by one for each device how they comply with the principles. The principle might be, for example, like essential principle number 8 is around infection control and microbial contamination. The TJ, I haven't got those words perfectly right, but we have to show that it's not going to pose a risk to the patient from those areas. So it's not like you can turn up and say, okay, how do I make this product? There's a standard which effectively specifies it. You've got to come up with it yourself. This is the first thing. The second thing is we run a quality system. So we run an ISO 13485 quality system. So most of the people listening will be really familiar with ISO 9001 as a quality system. ISO 13485 is the slightly gnarlier, more medical device focused brother of ISO 9001. It's out of the same family, but it's more comprehensive and it has more comprehensive requirements for traceability, design history files, and product development as well. So that's the gold standard in terms of the ISO stuff, and we have that for both of our facilities across Australia and New Zealand. In terms of the process, it's relatively simple at a high level. So step 1, collect the product. Step 2, sort, check the product hasn't got any damage. Step 3, put it through a cleaning and testing process, which will test it functionally, and then inspect it to make sure that it's got no further damage, package it, sticker it, and send it out the door. And throughout that process, we're also marking the product so we can see how many uses it's had with us, if it's in that category. Not all products have unique marking, but most of the ones that we deal with do. And we're also testing it. So if it fails any of the tests, no matter whether it's the first or the 50th time that's been remanufactured, it gets taken to the side and sent off to be recycled if possible, which is not always possible because the materials are complex. But we're working on a few things in that space to actually improve that locally. So it's a pretty straightforward process. It's repetitive. It's the same process every time. And as I touched on before, it doesn't matter how many times the product has been used for us. If it doesn't meet the standard, it doesn't get through the final door and out to the customer. And that's important. Not many people acknowledge this, but if you've had a product that's been used once or twice or 3 times, that shouldn't be the thing that defines whether it goes back to the customer. It should be whether the product does its job. And the reality is that one product might be on a patient once for 4 weeks, and one might be on 3 patients, but for only 1 hour at a time. And so your use cases are different. And that's why it's really important in the device categories that we operate in, which are non-sterile, to just test the device and make sure the device itself actually works. And then I'll add to that, we don't use any sterilization processes for our devices because they're not sterile. So we avoid having to put ethylene oxide on the product. That's a carcinogen. It's the most commonly used industrial sterilant. But if you put it on a product 4 times, or you use a product through that cycle 4 times, then it leaves a residue and you can't sell it anymore. So a bit of detail, but yeah, there's a bit to it.
This is a short interlude to again thank the sponsors that are making 2025's 50 Most Innovative campaign possible. Our appreciation goes out to these legends: Australia Wide Engineering Recruitment, TXM Lean Solutions, the Industry Capability Network, Bonfiglioli Australia, the Advanced Manufacturing Growth Centre, and the SmartCrete CRC. Now back to the show. It looks like it's one of those sort of examples where everyone wins. There's a saving to the healthcare system. There's a productivity gain because you're getting more with less. You're creating jobs. But, you know, I'd have to ask, with the straightforwardness, do you think there's any vulnerability to someone copying what you're doing? And do you think in those terms?
Yeah, I think it's kind of straightforward in some senses, but in other senses, it's taken a long time to actually get there. So kind of like some of the innovations that actually power that technology, as in the processes, they are not on the face of them very complicated innovations, but they did take 2 years to build because it's actually taken a lot of discovery and coming up with things and making them all work together. So there's that. That's an important factor. there's a lot of little changes that we've made, and we obviously have to document them through our quality system as we make them, that improve our processes, that increase the yield, make sure the devices aren't getting damaged, and ensure that our testing is fit for purpose every time. Little things like making sure that our machines are programmed by barcodes as opposed to being programmed by operators, which opens up our employment pool to people who don't necessarily know how to program machines, but they do know how to scan a barcode, which, obviously you're changing the game there. As with any innovation or any successful technology, each individual part is pretty simple. Even if you look at an iPhone compared to any other product, the screen or the camera or any one of those things in isolation is not in itself remarkable. It's the sum of the parts that's the real value. And I think that's kind of the way we have to think about it with us. So it's not just ingredients, it's a recipe. And that's kind of it. So what might seem straightforward to us, having been doing this for 7.5 years, possibly not for others.
One of the questions we're asking our guests during this most innovative series is, what makes a company innovative? Everyone has their own idea of it. What's yours?
I think people recognizing what it is the company is trying to do and what provides value to the customers that they're trying to serve is the foundation, because there's not much point innovating on something that's not going to provide value to your customers. So if everyone throughout the company, from the executive all the way through to the people who are actually on the floor remanufacturing stuff, understands what makes a difference and what makes a difference to the customer or what makes a difference to the company in such a way that it's going to pass on lower costs to the customer, then you get people coming off with lots of ideas. And the simple reality is that I'm not in our remanufacturings every day looking at how things are going and understanding that. So I'm no longer where I once was, closest to the process and able to come up with those insights. So having that culture where people who have ideas within the facility, and particularly those people who have just joined the company, when they have an idea, that idea gets recognized, it gets folded in, it gets translated into some action, and you turn that process increment by increment into a better process. And sometimes it's not an increment, it's a complete wholesale change that they've gone, hang on, why are you doing that? Let's improve this. So I think it's really about that. Understand why you're doing it, what good looks like, and then build the culture around it so that everyone can contribute to it. That is the most important thing. And then obviously keep your head up, make sure you're scanning the horizon to see when other opportunities come from outside the business too.
And so lastly, Ollie, what's one issue within manufacturing that isn't getting the attention it deserves?
I think one of the key issues that isn't getting the right attention or value placed on it that it deserves in manufacturing, or remanufacturing, same thing for us really, is the impact of providing jobs locally to people. I don't think that in areas where government procurement is buying from local manufacturing, which includes companies like Medsalv and also particularly social enterprises, they're not putting an appropriate level of credit to the jobs that are created by having that locally. And there are some simple realities in terms of labour cost across Australia versus other countries that actually it may be cheaper labour cost wise in other countries to do that. But the reality is those countries' labour force don't pay tax in Australia. And I think it would be great if it was able to be recognised, particularly by public organisations, that sometimes it's better to have a organisation that's on parity or slightly more expensive if they're actually paying tax in the country that the agency is buying from, and not just understanding that at a theoretical level, but attaching a number value to that so it influences. Typically things like social enterprise or environmental value or other kind of derivative or indirect values attach like a 10% weighting in procurement, whereas price is actually a major one. But if your bills are being paid by the Treasury, who in turn gets paid by the tax paid by the people in the market, I think there's a better way to actually acknowledge and accredit how that works. I don't think that in our sector that is something that's well understood, and there's a bit of a disconnect there that I think could be improved.
Well, I believe that's everything we have time for, so thank you very much for joining us, Ollie. It's been a pleasure having you on AU Manufacturing Conversations.
Awesome, thanks for having me.